Anti-Defamation League opposes Florida Amendment 8, the so-called Religious Freedom Amendment, because it really has nothing to do with religious freedom and everything to do with taxpayer funding of houses of worship. It's a confusing and misleading constitutional amendment that seeks to dupe Floridians into voting away 125-year-old church-state protections from the Florida Constitution and insert language into the Constitution which would require Florida taxpayers to fund houses of worship under many circumstances. So why does ADL think that's a bad idea? Well, first of all, it applies to all religious groups. So that means that Florida taxpayers could be required to fund houses of worship or sectarian institutions of which they're not affiliated, of which they don't agree, or even extremist religious groups, anti-Semitic groups, racist groups, or other extremist groups. This constitutional amendment would also, through a loophole that was never intended for taxpayer-funded jobs, to write in religious discrimination into Florida's Constitution. So that means for a taxpayer-funded job at a house of worship to do something like being a cook or a nurse, that institution could say no Jews, no Catholics, no Protestants apply. It also has absolutely no safeguards against use of government money for religious proselytizing or religious indoctrination. Clearly, taxpayer money should not be used for religious activity. And another important point which people seem to miss is this puts government in the driver's seat of deciding the winners and losers amongst religious groups. Which religious groups gets a grant to do services and which doesn't? What if you have 3 religious groups in the same area applying for the same money? Who's going to be the winner? Who's going to be the loser? What's that going to do for interfaith dialogue? So for all these reasons, we oppose it. And also the opposition, or rather the supporters of this amendment, they make new points which are nothing but fear and mistruth. The fear is that this amendment is somehow needed for religiously affiliated groups, which is different from houses of worship, to get money. So groups like Catholic Charities, Jewish Federations, Lutheran Social Services, religious affiliated hospitals and schools, they say, well, this amendment is needed to get that money. That's not true. Those institutions have been getting state tax dollars for years. They've been doing much needed work without any kind of issues of taxpayer-funded proselytizing or religious discrimination. The courts have held that they're allowed to get money under the Florida Constitution, so there's absolutely no issue there. The other issue that they point to, it's disingenuous. They say that this constitutional amendment was based in anti-Catholic animus when it was put in the Constitution 125 years ago. Well, that's not true either. First of all, the ACLU did a report last year which debunked that allegation that this is based on anti-Catholic animus. But I understand that some people view ACLU from a political perspective. They may not trust ACLU, but you don't have to rely on that report. First of all, even if you could argue that this was put in 125 years ago based on some kind of anti-Catholic animus, this provision, the no aid provision that the Florida Amendment seeks to remove and replace, was readopted 3 times in the 20th century, starting in 1968. Surely those were not times of anti-Catholic animus. And even the Florida courts have said there is no record of anti-Catholic animus when this amendment was put into the Constitution 125 years ago. And certainly in 1968, there was absolutely no record of anti-Catholic animus. So basically, the arguments put forth by supporters simply are not true. And this amendment would do tremendous damage for the individual religious liberty and separation of church and state in Florida. So that's why the Anti-Defamation League is vigorously opposing this amendment.
Why we arrived to this point? Who or what is behind this movement?
Well, I can tell you that this amendment was put on the ballot in 2011 by the legislature. This was not a voter-initiated ballot amendment. This is government getting into the business of religion, which is a bad idea, and that's why there is separation of government and religion in this country. But if you want to understand why the proponents of this, why they think it's a good idea for unregulated tax dollars to be siphoned or sent to our houses of worship, I think you'll have to ask the supporters. That there's something very unfair about this amendment. At minimum, the proponents of this amendment and the drafters should have been honest about what they were doing. What this amendment is about taxpayer funding of houses of worship. It's not about religious freedom, but it's written in a way to trick or fool Florida voters to vote for this amendment. Let's recall that it's going to be a very long ballot in Florida. We've got a presidential race, federal races, state races, county races, and then we're going to have 11 ballot amendments. So what's the name of this ballot amendment? It's religious freedom. I don't know anybody who's against religious freedom. So a voter rushing through their ballot, they're going to see religious freedom. Well, I'm for that. I'll vote for this. The other thing it does, to somebody who's not that familiar with First Amendment law, which is a very complex area, the ballot language could be read as simply putting the Florida Constitution on the same level as the First Amendment of the United States, and it doesn't do that. It requires taxpayers to fund houses of worship under many circumstances, which the First Amendment of the United States Constitution doesn't do. And the third thing, it really hides the ball, because it puts in this language that seems to be non-discrimination language when it's not at the beginning of the ballot language, and at the very end puts in the language stating that what this amendment really does is remove a provision from the Florida Constitution that prohibits the funding of houses of worship. So for all those reasons, this is a misleading amendment that is intended to dupe Floridians into voting away historic separation of church and state and voting away their individual religious liberty rights. At least the proponents of this should have been honest when putting it forward and not doing it in this disingenuous way. Anti-Defamation League is a 100-year-old civil rights and human relations organization. We're rooted in the Jewish community, but we believe that the way you protect the Jewish community is you protect everybody's civil rights. ADL believes that separation of church and state is the key to religious freedom in this country. It has allowed various religions to flourish. We believe that it's one of the reasons why America is one of the most religious of the Western nations. And this amendment, Amendment 8, would remove essential church-state protections from our Constitution, and for that reason, we are vigorously opposing this amendment.